of them a minute, sometimes just nonstop until, till whenever, until it's identified. A couple of applications that we found, one of them is, we'll talk a little bit about them here in a little bit, but one of them, or a series of them, actually sent SMS messages to premium rate numbers. I think it was $6 US per message. It's very interesting because that affects the service provider and it affects the user or the enterprise that owns those devices. The service provider, we did a little study with Verizon and with AT&T, and we found out that every call that a service provider receives for support for malware costs that service provider $9 per call. Okay, that's a major, major investment. It's a major loss of capital for them if they have to deal with applications on their mobile devices that are doing anything that they're not supposed to do. So these SMS Trojans, when they send that, they send those messages, that's irretrievable. That user, whether they may be comped back by the service provider still has to pick up the tab for that because that money's being deposited in that whoever owns that account. So it's a way for these malware developers to monetize their malware as opposed to what they had to do in the PC space where there's not a direct capability to monetize it like we see in mobile devices. It may seem simple. In Android, we are actually currently looking at, I think, 6 or 7 different samples of malware. 4 of them have SMS or premium rate SMS messaging on the back end of them. Okay, so those are occurring still. As you may or may not know, Symbian, Windows Mobile have been around for quite a while. Our mobile malware database at this point is somewhere over 12,000 samples of mobile malware. I'd say probably 75% of that is Symbian and Windows Mobile. And of those Symbian and Windows Mobile malware samples that exist in our database, 85% of those, or 87% of those, are SMS Trojans. Okay? And these are applications, running the gamut of what Symbian and Windows Mobile applications can do, but in the background, they've just been pirated. They've been pulled apart. The malicious code stuffed back in them. They're repackaged, and then they're distributed as legitimate applications, and users are downloading them from wherever they can get them, and in the background, they're sending these SMS messages off. May not seem like that big of a deal unless you're a service provider who has to, one, answer the calls for users trying to dispute these charges on their mobile account, and then for them to try to have to recoup the costs that have been deposited into that premium rate number. iPhone data. Anybody hear the big issue, I don't know, 6-8 months ago, where iPhone GPS data was being leaked and Android GPS data was being leaked? Okay, this is a little bit different than that, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what we found here is we did a little bit of research, and we determined that over Wi-Fi, any mobile device, if you're on an unencrypted network, all that data is clear text. And if you have some sort of Wireshark or TCP dump or whatever sitting on that wireless network, then you can grab that data. So one of the things that was interesting to us is with Symbian and Windows Mobile, you may have noticed, or may not, that there really was no concerted effort to centralize application publishment, I guess, or application distribution. What we found was with Symbian and Windows Mobile is there are third-party websites all over the world, mostly in China, mostly in Asia, that host all of these kinds of applications. And it's really just free for all. It's really the wild, wild west of applications. You have legitimate applications in there. You have applications that were legitimate before they were pulled off and they were pirated and malicious code stuffed in them, and then they were being redistributed. You really have no way of knowing if an application is legitimate or not. What we found with Android and with the iPhone is this is really where the two operating systems or the two platforms are differentiating themselves as far as security. If you were to ask me if Android is more or less secure than the iPhone, I'm going to tell you no. They're really the same. The difference is the way that the two platforms attempt to distribute applications. With the iPhone, the iTunes App Store operates on kind of a walled garden approach where there's a review process to their applications to make sure that those applications meet certain requirements, they don't violate terms of services. Is it possible to bypass or to get through that review process with a malicious application? Probably. With the Android market, there is no review process. Okay? It is open source. And their idea was they wanted users to be able to, not users, but developers to be able to write applications relatively cheap. I think it's $25 for a developer account. And then you just put applications out there. Okay? There's no review whatsoever. So you can have applications that can monitor GPS location, GPS data, all these SMS Trojans. The applications exist out there. There's no review process until people like us go through those distribution points, and we look at the applications, and we go back to Google, and we say, hey, this application is malicious, and then they revoke it, then they'll pull it. That's it. That still leaves a window of some sort of zero-day threat, whether it's 5, 10, 15 days, 3 months for a malicious application to possibly exist in that environment. That's the environment that Google's created for itself, as opposed to the environment that Apple has created for itself. What we're finding is, because this is a multi-billion-dollar-a-year business, it makes no sense for a malware developer to write malware for the iPhone. There's a review process. Could they potentially get past it? Absolutely they could. It's happened. We know it's happened. But if I'm going to spend development cycles and resources and capital at developing a malware application, why would I focus it at all or pay any attention to the iPhone where it may not get through when I can just get it on Android, on the Android device? So that's what's happening right now, currently today, as far as mobile malware goes. Why is Android getting its proverbial butt kicked? Because of the ecosystem that they've fostered in the Android market at this point. Is their platform more or less secure than the iPhone? Probably not. It's probably relatively close to being the same. But as a malware writer, I'm not even going to pay attention to the iPhone. I'm not going to focus research cycles against it. I'm not going to try to identify ways to get into it when I don't have to. All I have to do is I have to go to the Android market, release an application. Android at this point, whether you know it or not, currently has the world market share in mobile platform. It's the same argument if you were to ask me, is Windows more or less secure than Apple or Macs? Probably not. But Windows holds about 93% of the world market share. Again, it makes no sense for a malware writer to develop malware for something that only 7% of the world is paying attention to, when the other 93% is paying attention to, and the security awareness of those users is really low. That's what we're seeing play out right now in Android. Okay, and we'll talk about how this is kind of how it's creating an issue. So one of the things that's important is to understand that the trends that we saw in mobile malware complexity, that we saw the increases in the complexity from Symbian and Windows Mobile, we're now currently seeing playing out in Android. Okay? So Symbian and Windows Mobile, because it's been around for quite a while, Symbian used to hold the world market share until probably a little less than a year ago, until Android took it over. The mobile malware applications that affect Symbian and Windows Mobile, they already run the full gambit of what PC malware does. We have bots in mobile malware in Symbian and Windows Mobile. We've seen pirated apps. We've seen apps that are polymorphic. Does anybody know what polymorphic means? It has the ability to, once it infects, it changes its signature and before it infects other devices, so it's not really the same malware on one device as it is on the other. It's a little bit different. It has the ability to change itself. We've seen that in mobile malware. Rootkits, spyware, SMS Trojans, everything that we see in PC malware, we currently see in mobile, at least in Symbian and Windows Mobile. That took about 6 or 7 years to get to that point in Symbian and Windows Mobile. In Android, it took less than a year to get from a very basic phishing application that hit the Android market in January of 2010 by a developer named Droid09. And what it was, this is amazing to me. What it was an application that was supposed to facilitate access to your online bank account. Your bank's, yeah, I laugh too. It's ridiculous. 150,000 people downloaded this. It's ridiculous. And what it was is it basically, the description of the application said that it worked for like Chase Bank and a bunch of banks over in England and in Europe. And it was supposed to basically allow you access to your bank's online website. But it asked you for your username and your password to your bank site, and then it just opened a browser connection to your bank. That was it. but it collected that data and it shipped it off to a third-party server. 150,000 people downloaded this application. Insanity. So from that was really the first Android malware that we saw, and that was January 2010. And today, we're looking at applications that are rooting devices. They're polymorphic. They're changing. They're setting up bots. They're receiving command and control from third-party servers. It's insane the stuff that they're doing. But same way Windows Mobile took about 6 years to get to that point. Android's taken less than a year to get to that point. Okay, so this really is the same malware developers and the same attackers. They already know how to write the stuff. They already know how to get the access to the stuff that they want. It didn't take them as long to figure it out this time. And the Android's open approach, it just invites malware development. Whether you are a proponent of open source or not, for a platform as far as security research goes and identifying vulnerabilities in a platform, open source I think is probably the smartest way to do it. You want the community collaborating. That's what Google tried to do with the Android market. They want the community collaborating inside their market. But we see what it's created. It's created quite a mess. But we know that no platform is immune to mobile malware. BlackBerry has malware. It exists. The iPhone has malware. It exists. There are people that do focus some levels of research against these platforms. But the real complex stuff that requires a lot of research and a lot of development cycles, they're just not doing it for the BlackBerry and the iPhone. They're just not. They don't care about it because they're not going to make the money off of it. There's an opportunity that it won't even get through the Apple review process, or the BlackBerry enterprise server on the back end of that enterprise is just going to shut it down to begin with. It just doesn't make any sense to do it. Storm 8, that's a company that is currently being sued by Apple. They created a game that they got past the review process, and it was in the iTunes App Store. Users were downloading it, and they were playing the game, and they had quite a few games. In the background, it was gathering up device identifying information, IMEI information, all that stuff, and it was shipping it off to third-party servers. At some point, and we'll talk a little bit about this, because almost every piece of malware today is gathering that data. It's gathering the IMEI, the phone number, and certain device information so that it can register it for botnets. At some point, we have to have a discussion of whether that data is really personal or not. GPS data, whether that's really personal identifying information or not. As a user, if you want location-based services on your device, you have to, for the most part, have location. Applications have to have access to that data. If you do a Google search on your phone and you want the closest restaurant and you type in Applebee's or whatever, you don't want them to give you results for an Applebee's in Washington State. You want an Applebee's where you're at. Okay, that location data is required for those applications to do that, for that user experience. At some point, we have to have a discussion of whether that's personal data or not. At this point, it's considered personal information. So applications that access that data without the user knowing that it's accessing that data, they're being called malware, for what it's worth. iPhone 4, iPad credentials stolen in 6 minutes. That is the example that I was talking about where basically we broke the encryption on the iPhone 3GS. This kid did it with really the same methodology that we used on the iPhone 4, except he scripted a lot of it out to the point where he was able to plug it in, hit go, and 6 minutes later he had a bunch of data off the encrypted device. Another interesting study that was revealed in this NDSS conference. Does anybody here have an iPhone? Anybody use the iPhone? Do you jailbreak your iPhone? I assumed you would. You do. When you jailbroke your iPhone, what was one of the first new applications you saw on there? Cydia. Cydia is really a third-party app store that allows developers to publish applications that wouldn't get by the Apple review process, correct? That's the whole reason why users jailbreak their device, is they want access to applications that they want, as opposed to ones that Apple tells them that they can have, okay? That's the discussion and the argument that the App Store has. Well, I want what I want. I don't want you to control what I can get access to, so we jailbreak. One of the things that security researchers have been trying to tell people is that, well, okay, it's kind of split down the middle. Some people will tell you that Cydia is really just a place for iPhone malware to exist, or malicious applications to exist, because it's not